It is 4:58 in the morning on a Thursday in October 2025. The port of Tampa is already alive. Forklifts move in the dark. Diesel engines idle on the apron. The smell of saltwater and hydraulic fluid hangs over everything. On the north side of the terminal, tucked behind a row of refrigerated units and a chain-link perimeter fence, sits a freight consolidation warehouse. A long, low metal building with a painted sign above the roll-up doors. Suncoast Cargo Solutions, LLC. Export forwarding. Temperature-sensitive logistics. Caribbean routes. 14 vehicles are staged in a loose cordon 2 blocks out. No lights, no sirens. Engines off. Inside the lead vehicle, a black Chevrolet Suburban with no markings, the senior deputy U.S. Marshal for the Middle District of Florida checks her watch and keys her radio. She says one word: execute. 7 entry teams move at once. 3 breach points on the warehouse floor. 2 on the adjoining trailer yard. 1 on the administrative annex at the south end of the building. 1 covering the only vehicle exit onto Channelside Drive. The loading bay doors come up fast. Agents flood the floor in a single wave, flashlights cutting through the dark interior. At 5:01 a.m., the first voice calls out, U.S. Marshals, on the ground, hands where we can see them. In the back of the warehouse, behind a floor-to-ceiling rack of strapped pallets, a man is caught mid-step. He is wearing a yellow hard hat and a reflective vest with the word Loadmaster stenciled on the back. He freezes. He does not run. He sits down on the concrete and puts his hands on his knees, and the expression on his face is not surprise. It is the particular, exhausted look of a man who has known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this morning was coming. His name, for the purposes of this story, is Marcus Dellinger. He has 3 active federal warrants. He has been wanted for 22 months. And for the last 11 of those months, he has been hiding in plain sight, clocking in 6 days a week at this warehouse, moving export containers toward a Caribbean transshipment route that, as far as he understood it, was one of the least watched pathways out of the United States. He was not wrong about that. What he was wrong about was the analyst who had been watching him anyway. This is the story of Operation Closed Manifest, an 11-month joint investigation by the U.S. Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force and Homeland Security Investigations that dismantled what federal prosecutors would later call the most sophisticated domestic fugitive extraction network they had seen routed through the American export supply chain. 9 fugitives captured, $3.7 million in undeclared cash seized, 7 containers held at the port of Tampa, 16 individuals indicted, 240 falsified bills of lading recovered, 5 false identities constructed, 9 financial accounts frozen. All of it traced back to a single anomaly, a discrepancy so small it almost didn't make it into a report. 11 seconds of metadata from an encrypted messaging application, time-stamped against a warehouse shift schedule. That is where this story begins. It begins not at the port, but in a windowless office on the 4th floor of the Ybor City Federal Building in Tampa, Florida. November 2024. A Marshals Service intelligence analyst, call her Rivera, is running a routine fugitive update cycle. This is not glamorous work. It means cross-referencing wanted persons databases against recent digital pings, social media, financial transactions, cell tower hits, subscriber data pulled on legal process. Most of it produces nothing. Most days, Rivera flags 2 or 3 leads that go cold within 48 hours. On this particular Tuesday morning, she is reviewing the warrant file for Marcus Dellinger. Dellinger has been wanted since January 2024 on federal charges of wire fraud and conspiracy, a financial scheme that defrauded investors in a logistics startup out of approximately $800,000. He missed his arraignment date, forfeited his bond, and disappeared. One sighting in Miami in March 2024, nothing since. Rivera is going through his known communications platforms, the standard sweep, when she notices something. Dellinger had been a user of a specific encrypted messaging application, one of several that came up in the original fraud investigation. The application does not reveal message content, but the server logs, obtained through a Title III order that had been issued in the underlying fraud case and was still technically active, reveal one thing: connection metadata. Timestamps showing when a user on a known device ID connected to the application's server. The metadata shows a cluster of connection events in the Tampa metropolitan area. Dellinger's device. The connections are brief, a minute or 2 each time, but they follow a pattern. They occur almost exclusively between 5:30 and 6 o'clock in the morning, 6 days a week. And they stop, consistently, between 6 and 6:10, then nothing until after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Rivera stares at that pattern for a long time. She pulls up a shift schedule database for major employers in the Tampa logistics sector, a database the Marshals maintain for exactly this kind of analysis. She is looking for something that starts at 6 a.m. and ends around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Suncoast Cargo Solutions, LLC. Dock operations. Shift 1, 6 a.m. to 3 p.m., Monday through Saturday. She writes 3 lines in her case notes. Then she picks up the phone and calls the HSI resident agent in charge in Tampa. I spent hours going through the archived version of that initial report, and one detail kept pulling at me. Rivera's note doesn't say, "I believe Dellinger is there." It says, simply, "Connection pattern is consistent with employment schedule at this address. Recommend physical surveillance." 11 words. That's the seam the whole operation threads through. The Tampa HSI office assigns 2 agents to drive past Suncoast Cargo Solutions the following morning before dawn. They park on the far side of Channelside Drive with a long lens camera at 5:45 a.m. At 6:04, a man matching Dellinger's physical description, 6'1", heavy-set, walking with a slight forward lean, enters the warehouse through the side personnel door. He is wearing a yellow hard hat. He is carrying a thermos. They do not approach. They drive away and call Rivera. That is day 1 of what will become an 11-month covert investigation. The first decision the task force makes is not to move quickly. This is deliberate and, at the time, not universally popular. The instinct in fugitive work is to confirm the location and go. But the marshal's supervisor overseeing the case, call him Hargrove, makes the call to hold. He wants to understand why Dellinger chose this particular job, at this particular company, on this particular route. His suspicion is that Dellinger is not simply hiding. He is planning to leave. That suspicion shapes everything that follows. Rather than execute an arrest warrant immediately, the task force opens a full investigation with HSI as co-lead. They pull every available record on Suncoast Cargo Solutions, corporate registration, customs and border protection, import-export filings, shipper export declarations, manifest records, financial records obtained through grand jury subpoena. They install covert pole cameras on the street and on a utility pole adjacent to the north loading bay. 2 cameras running continuously, feeding encrypted video back to a secure server. What they find over the next 60 days. Suncoast Cargo Solutions is a real company. It does real freight work. It moves consolidated cargo, small shipments from multiple shippers combined into single containers toward Caribbean destinations, primarily through a transshipment hub in Kingston, Jamaica, before onward routing to Havana. The company has the appropriate export licenses. Its manifest filings are, on the surface, in order. But there are anomalies. Small ones at first. A Customs and Border Protection analyst embedded with the task force pulls a sample of Suncoast's shipper export declarations, the documents that accompany every outbound container, and begins comparing them against the actual container manifests. He flags something on his 3rd day of reviewing records. 14 declarations describe cargo as industrial equipment components, non-hazardous, with a declared value of between $8,000 and $12,000 per container. But the weight certifications on the same containers are running significantly heavier than the declared contents would account for. Not by a little, by an average of 430 kilograms per container. The CBP analyst writes it up as a potential commodity misdescription. A customs violation, not a federal crime. But it goes into the case file. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeats. Container after container. The weights don't match the declared contents. The task force begins running the containers through non-intrusive imaging, X-ray screening, as they move through the terminal, using CBP's existing port inspection program as cover. They are careful not to flag the containers for secondary inspection, which would alert Suncoast to scrutiny. They are simply looking. What the X-ray images show is consistent across 7 containers flagged over 4 months. Dense, irregular mass concentrations in the lower portions of the containers. Not weapons, not narcotics. The density profiles are consistent with bundled paper currency, wrapped and sealed and packed low in the containers beneath legitimate cargo. That changes the character of the investigation entirely. This is no longer just a fugitive hiding at a freight company. This is a money movement operation. And if cash is moving out in containers, the next question is immediate. What is coming back in exchange? And who else, besides Dellinger, is using this pipeline? Here is the structural blind spot the operation was exploiting. Outbound containers from US ports receive a fraction of the physical inspection that inbound containers do. The post-9/11 security architecture was built around the threat of things coming in: weapons, contraband, people. The export lane is, by comparison, almost unwatched. Suncoast Cargo Solutions was not a sophisticated criminal enterprise in most respects, but it had found and was deliberately operating inside one of the most reliable gaps in the federal inspection regime. The task force brings in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division in February 2025. They also bring in a second HSI unit, the Financial Crimes Group out of Miami, to run a parallel financial analysis. What the financial team finds over the next 6 weeks is a web of shell company transactions that would eventually account for approximately $3.7 million in undeclared currency moving through the Suncoast operation over an estimated 14-month period. The money is not Dellinger's. He is a piece of this, not the architect. The financial trail points toward a separate organizing figure, call him Cardenas, who is not himself wanted when the investigation opens, but who is, the task force determines, a facilitator, someone who has built and is running a pipeline that offers services to multiple clients. Fugitives who want out, money that needs to move without going through a wire transfer that would trigger a currency transaction report. The two services complement each other. The cash funds the logistics. The fugitives provide labor and ground-level operational cover inside the warehouse. That is the model, and it has been running. The financial analysis will ultimately determine since at least the spring of 2024. Here's the part that doesn't add up on the surface. Cardenas is not a fugitive himself. He shows up for work at a legitimate freight brokerage in Fort Lauderdale. He pays his taxes. He has no prior record. He is, by every surface-level indicator, a law-abiding logistics professional. What he has built, very quietly, over several years, is a sideline business. A service, in essence, for people who need to disappear from the United States and take money with them when they do. For that sideline business, he chose the Cuba route specifically and deliberately. Not because he has connections in Cuba, but because the transshipment structure, cargo moving through Kingston before onward routing to Havana, creates a documentation gap. Once a container clears the U.S. export declaration and boards a vessel in Tampa, the onward routing through a third country makes the ultimate destination and ultimate recipients of the container's contents substantially harder to trace through routine monitoring. By March 2025, the task force has identified 4 additional individuals connected to the Suncoast operation, all of them, like Dellinger, present inside the warehouse, all with active federal warrants from other districts. Wire fraud, bank fraud, a federal firearms conviction with a supervised release violation, a fugitive from a conspiracy charge out of the Southern District of New York who had been wanted for 14 months. All of them are using the same operational cover, employment at Suncoast Cargo Solutions, under names that do not match their warrant files. 5 false identities, constructed using a combination of fraudulent employment documentation and legitimate social security numbers belonging to deceased individuals. A technique the indictment will later describe as identity layering. Each fugitive has a paper trail that, to routine human resources processing, looks clean. The task force faces a significant problem in March. They have identified 4 additional fugitives inside the facility. They have a developing financial case, but they do not yet have the evidence they need to charge Cardenas, who is the operational hub. Move on the warehouse now, arresting the fugitives, and Cardenas will know immediately that the pipeline has been discovered. He will destroy records, he will disappear. They get the small fish and lose the network. Hargrove's call is to wait, to keep watching, to develop the case on Cardenas. That decision carries a real cost. Every week the operation continues means a week where wanted individuals remain at large. One of the fugitives inside the warehouse, the firearms conviction, is not a low-level offender. Keeping him under surveillance rather than in custody is the kind of decision that keeps supervisors awake at night. But the case against the full network requires it. Think about Hargrove's position for a moment. He knows where 4 wanted men are. He can arrest them today. But if he does, the man who built the system they're using walks free, and the pipeline continues, probably under a different name and a different warehouse. What do you do? In April 2025, the task force makes contact with a cooperating witness. He is a dockworker, a legitimate employee of the freight terminal, not of Suncoast itself, who has noticed things he doesn't understand and doesn't like. He has not reported them. He has not benefited from them. He is simply a man who has been watching things happen around him at the port and has become, in his own word to the HSI agent who approaches him, uncomfortable. Call him Tomas. He works the early shift. He handles container positioning and seal logging. Over approximately 5 months, he has observed Suncoast containers being loaded with sealed secondary packages that don't appear on any manifest he has access to, by individuals working late in the warehouse after the primary shift ends. He has observed this on at least 6 separate occasions. He noted the container numbers in a personal log he kept on his phone. That log, 6 container numbers, 6 dates, 6 approximate times, is the evidentiary foundation the task force has been waiting for. Combined with the X-ray imaging data and the financial analysis, it is enough to establish probable cause for a search warrant covering the warehouse and all Suncoast containers staged for export. But there is an obstacle. Tomas's log covers containers that have already shipped. They are gone, either in transit or already offloaded in Kingston. The task force needs to catch containers currently staged, with the secondary packages still inside, before they board a vessel. And the next scheduled vessel departure from Tampa on the Suncoast route is October 16, 2025. That gives them a hard deadline. Everything the investigation needs to accomplish before it can execute has to be done before that ship sails. The final weeks of the investigation are the most operationally complex. The task force is now running 4 parallel tracks. Track 1, Financial. The IRS-KI agents and the HSI Financial Crimes team are finalizing the forensic accounting that will support the money laundering charges against Cardenas and 3 associates. They are working from bank records, wire transfer logs, corporate formation documents for a series of shell companies registered in Florida, Wyoming, and Nevada, and a set of cryptocurrency wallet records obtained through a court order that took 6 weeks to execute. Track 2, Warrants. The Marshals are preparing individual arrest warrant packages for 9 individuals. The 5 fugitives identified inside the warehouse, Cardenas, and 3 additional co-conspirators identified through the financial investigation. Each package requires a separate probable cause affidavit tailored to that individual's role. Track 3, Search Warrants. A federal magistrate has to authorize the search of the warehouse and the 7 specific containers. The affidavit supporting that warrant runs 84 pages. Track 4, Coordination. The takedown involves multiple agencies across 2 districts. The Middle District of Florida is the lead jurisdiction, but 2 of the arrest warrants belong to other districts, Southern District of New York and Northern District of Georgia. Coordination calls between the districts are running daily by early October. On October 9th, 6 days before the vessel departure, something goes wrong. One of the surveillance cameras on the pole, adjacent to the warehouse loading bay, goes dark. The feed drops at 11:47 p.m. and does not come back. The technical team determines within 2 hours that the camera has not been discovered and disabled. It has experienced a hardware failure, a power circuit issue unrelated to the investigation. But for 9 hours, there is no visual coverage of the north loading bay. During those 9 hours, the task force does not know whether additional containers have been staged, whether personnel have been moved, or whether the operational pattern has changed. When the camera comes back online at 8:52 a.m. on October 10th, agents reviewing the feed have to work through the 9-hour gap using thermal imaging from a secondary device, a lower resolution backup, to reconstruct what happened on the loading dock overnight. They determined that 2 additional containers were staged during the gap. They cannot fully confirm whether those containers received secondary packages. That uncertainty forces a revision of the search warrant affidavit. The agents need to add the 2 new containers to the warrant, which requires a supplemental filing and an emergency call to the magistrate. The supplemental warrant is signed at 4:11 p.m. on October 14th, 20 hours before the planned execution. The most surprising thing about this case isn't the financial architecture. It's that the whole operation nearly had to be delayed because of a faulty power circuit in a pole camera that cost less than $400. Federal investigations of this complexity are held together, at the margins, by very ordinary things. One more complication. On the evening of October 15th, the surveillance team observes Cardenas arriving at the Suncoast warehouse for the first time in 3 weeks. He is there for 47 minutes. He walks the container staging area. He speaks briefly with two individuals the task force has identified as co-conspirators. He leaves at 7:22 p.m. The task force does not know why he is there. He may be doing a routine check. He may have received some signal that has made him nervous. He may simply be there because the ship is leaving the next morning. Hargrove makes the call to move up the execution time by 30 minutes, from 5:28 to 4:58 a.m. He also adds a surveillance unit on Cardenas's Fort Lauderdale residence, in case Cardenas attempts to leave the area overnight. Cardenas does go home. The surveillance unit confirms his vehicle in the driveway at 8:45 p.m. They watch it until 4:30 a.m. when a second team moves to execute the arrest warrant at the Fort Lauderdale address simultaneously with the warehouse raid in Tampa. The case was ready to close. Except even with every warrant signed and every team in position, nobody on the task force was entirely certain, right up until 4:58 a.m., whether Dellinger would be in the warehouse when the doors came up. He had been there every day for 11 months. But on the day it mattered most, there was no guarantee. What no one saw coming was the radio call at 4:54 a.m., 4 minutes before execution, from the surveillance team on foot near the personnel entrance. Subject is on premises, hard hat on, already at his station. He had come in early. At 4:58 a.m., the senior deputy U.S. Marshal transmits the execute order and 14 vehicles begin moving. The entry teams on the warehouse floor have 47 seconds from the moment the first door comes up to the first verbal contact. The building is 112 feet wide and 380 feet deep. There are 7 individuals present on the floor at the time of entry, 5 of them fugitives, 2 of them Suncoast employees with no warrants, who are immediately separated and held for witness interviews. Marcus Dellinger is found in the rear staging area at 5:01 a.m. He does not run. He does not resist. He sits down on the concrete floor and waits. The second fugitive, the bank fraud warrant from northern Georgia, is found in the loading dock cab of a yard truck. He attempts to exit through the passenger side door and makes it approximately 12 feet before 2 deputies bring him to the ground. He is in handcuffs at 5:03 a.m. The third and fourth fugitives, both connected to the wire fraud ring, are in the administrative annex. They are seated at a table with coffee when the entry team comes through the south door. Neither moves. One puts his hands flat on the table and says nothing. The other begins to cry quietly. Both are detained without incident at 5:04 a.m. The fifth fugitive, the federal firearms conviction, the one who has been keeping Hargrove awake, is found in the gap between 2 container stacks at the east end of the building. He has heard the entry and moved to the shadows. He is not armed. A K-9 team locates him at 5:09 a.m., and he surrenders immediately when the dog comes around the corner of the container. 5 fugitives in the warehouse, all in custody by 5:09 a.m. At 5 a.m. in Fort Lauderdale, a 4-person HSI team executes the arrest warrant at Cardenas's residence. He answers the door himself, a detail that appears, in slightly different form, in every account of the arrest. He is in a bathrobe. He looks at the badge held up in the light of his front porch and says, in a voice the arresting agent will later describe as almost conversational, "I expected this to come from a different direction." He is in handcuffs at 5:03 a.m. 3 additional co-conspirators are arrested at separate locations in the Tampa Bay area and Sarasota County between 5 o'clock and 6:30 a.m. on October 16th. All 3 are taken without incident. 9 fugitives and co-conspirators. 9 arrests, no shots fired. No injuries to agents or subjects. At 6:47 a.m., the task force commander confirms all subjects in custody and transmits the all clear. At the port, CBP officers place formal holds on 7 export containers staged in the Suncoast yard. The vessel that was scheduled to receive them departs on time. Without them, the locks are cut at 7:12 a.m. The containers are opened one by one, in the presence of evidence technicians and a CBP import specialist. In 5 of the 7 containers, beneath layers of industrial supply pallets and shrink-wrapped equipment components, agents find vacuum-sealed packages of U.S. currency. The packages are stacked in wooden crating frames bolted to the container floor, built to stay in place under the movement of ocean transit. The total currency recovered from the 5 containers, $3.7 million. Denominations range from 20s to hundreds. The bills are bundled in $10,000 stacks. There are 370 stacks. Also recovered, a portable document scanner, 2 laptop computers, a folder of laminated identity cards in names that do not belong to any of the arrested individuals, and a handwritten ledger. actual paper, in a manila envelope taped to the inside wall of the fourth container, listing container numbers, departure dates, passenger notations in shorthand, and figures in US dollars. That ledger becomes the central exhibit in the government's case. It covers 14 months of operations. It references, by code name and container number, at least 11 separate movements. Movements the task force will spend the next 3 months attempting to reconstruct. Some of those movements, investigators determine, were successful. People left the country using this pipeline before October 16, 2025. How many and where they are now remains a piece of the case that has not been fully resolved. The indictment, returned by a federal grand jury in the Middle District of Florida in December 2025, charges 16 individuals. The charges include conspiracy to harbor federal fugitives, bulk cash smuggling, money laundering, wire fraud, identity fraud, and, for Cardenas specifically, operating a criminal enterprise under 18 U.S.C. Section 1962. The RICO charge against Cardenas is significant. It reflects the government's framing of the operation, not as a series of individual crimes, but as a structured, ongoing enterprise with an organizational hierarchy, defined services, and a customer base. Prosecutors will argue that Cardenas's operation charged fees ranging from $30,000 to $80,000 per individual assisted, and that the undeclared cash being moved through the containers was, in part, those fees being laundered back out of the country alongside the clients. Here is what most coverage of this case won't say directly: the fact that this network operated for over a year inside a licensed freight company, processed 240 falsified export documents through the automated export system without triggering a single enforcement flag, and moved 11 or more individuals before a single arrest was made, is not a story about criminal sophistication. It is a story about a structural gap that the federal inspection apparatus has known about for years and has not adequately addressed. The export lane is not watched. That is not a secret. It is a policy choice, and it has consequences. 9 financial accounts connected to Cardenas and his associates are frozen in the wake of the indictment, containing a combined total the government has not fully disclosed, but that court filings reference as in excess of $2 million. Suncoast Cargo Solutions LLC has its export license suspended pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. The company's principal, a man with no apparent connection to the criminal conspiracy, who appears to have been unaware his facility was being used as a base of operations, cooperates fully with investigators. Marcus Dellinger, at his initial appearance in federal court in Tampa, is ordered held without bail. His attorney notes that prosecutors describe Dellinger's role as that of a worker, not a planner, that he was himself a client of the network who remained as a functioning employee, in part because he could not afford the extraction fee Cardenas charged. He is awaiting trial on the underlying fraud charges plus conspiracy to harbor fugitives. Of the 9 individuals arrested on October 16th, 7 have entered not guilty pleas. 2 have entered into cooperation agreements with the government. Those cooperation agreements are, in the investigators' view, the most important development of the post-indictment phase. Because the 2 cooperators are providing information about movements that were completed before October 16th. People who used this pipeline and made it out. Where they went, what names they are using, whether they are still reachable through law enforcement channels given the diplomatic complexities of the Cuba route. That part of the case, the part about who got away, is still active. Comment yes or no. Do you think a network like this has already rebuilt itself somewhere else in the US export system? One detail that stuck with me when I went through the case file, the handwritten ledger recovered from the 4th container. Real paper in a manila envelope, taped to a container wall with duct tape. In a world where everyone assumes sophisticated criminal operations have gone entirely digital. The ledger's physicality is the reason the task force was able to reconstruct 11 months of operations in weeks rather than years. Digital records can be encrypted, they can be wiped. Paper, in a sealed container on the way to Havana, was supposed to be untouchable. It was not, because the container never made it to Havana. There is a line in the government sentencing memorandum for one of the co-conspirators, a logistical coordinator who handled the falsified bills of lading, that reads almost like something out of a procedural novel. It says, the defendant facilitated the movement of individuals whose identities had been deliberately erased from the domestic record, through a supply chain whose outbound documentation is processed by machine rather than reviewed by human eyes, toward a destination where U.S. law enforcement authority terminates at the waterline. toward a destination where U.S. law enforcement authority terminates at the waterline. That sentence was written by a federal prosecutor to explain to a judge why the conduct was serious. It also happens to be a precise and accurate description of the structural condition that made the conduct possible. We track what comes next. Subscribe to the Bureau files so the next case finds you first. The network built by the man this story calls Cardenas is dismantled. The pipeline is closed, the containers are impounded, the accounts are frozen. On the surface, it looks like a clean resolution. 9 arrested, 16 indicted. A gap in the export inspection regime publicly acknowledged in the sentencing filings. But the ledger covers 14 months and 11 movements. 9 of those movements resulted in arrests on October 16, 2025. 2 more are the subject of active cooperation. That leaves, at minimum, a handful of individuals who moved through this pipeline and have not been accounted for. Some of them may be outside U.S. jurisdiction. Some may be in jurisdictions where the diplomatic pathways for extradition are uncertain at best, non-existent at worst, and the export lane is still there. 240 falsified bills of lading moved through the automated export system over 14 months before a single one was flagged, and they were not flagged by the system. They were flagged by a Marshals analyst who noticed 11 seconds of metadata on a Tuesday morning and asked a simple question: why does this phone only connect between 5:30 and 6 a.m.? The question nobody has fully answered is how many other phones are out there, connecting at odd hours, from warehouses near ports that handle outbound containers that nobody is opening. The containers leaving this country number in the millions every year. The ones that receive anything close to physical inspection represent a small fraction of that total. The cargo goes out, the manifests are filed, the ship sails. In the 4th container opened on the morning of October 16th, beneath the currency and the crating frames, agents found a single item that had apparently been left behind. Not hidden, not concealed, just forgotten or abandoned. A laminated identification card. Not one of the 5 false identities catalogued in the indictment. A 6th. A name, a photograph, a date of birth. The photograph shows a man who has not been identified. The name does not match any record in any federal database. The card sits in an evidence vault in Tampa. The man in the photograph has not been found.